All right, and on that note, let's get started. So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. My name is Greta Zaro and I'm the organizing director of World Beyond War. I'm joined today by my co-host Mark Elliott Stein, who is the technology director at World Beyond War. And today's webinar is all about civilian-based defense, and I'm so excited to introduce our two guests, Rivera Sun and Philippe Duhamel, who are really experts on this topic. So thank you to the participants for joining us on Zoom and for joining us on the Facebook live stream on World Beyond War's Facebook page today. World Beyond War is a grassroots global network of volunteers, activists, and allied organizations advocating for the end to all war and its replacement with a just and sustainable peace. Like I said, tonight's webinar is all about civilian-based defense, and I'm going to read a quote from our book, which says, "Nonviolence reveals the true power relationship, which is that all governments rest on the consent of the governed, and that consent can always be withdrawn." And that is the essence behind civilian-based defense, which is a nonviolent alternative to war. And so next I'll introduce our two guests. First, we have Philippe Duhamel. He is a trainer, creative strategist, and organizer of grassroots campaigns that call upon various methods of civil resistance, including non-cooperation and nonviolent direct action. Over 3 decades, Philippe has co-designed and waged campaigns tackling the arms race, Canadian complicity with apartheid, military intervention in Central America, the genocidal attacks on East Timor, and much more. His current work now focuses on green energy transition and preventing new dirty energy infrastructure. Welcome, Philippe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our second guest is Rivera Sun. She is an activist, author, and an advisory board member to World Beyond War. She has written many novels centering nonviolent struggle and peace. She is also the editor of the weekly Nonviolence News. She is a trainer in strategy for nonviolent movements, an alumna and a presenter at the James Lawson Institute. She served as the program's coordinator and digital strategist for Pace e Bene Campaign Nonviolence and was a creative advisor to the Nonviolence Now project, among her many accomplishments. Welcome, Rivera.
Thank you, Greta. It's great to be here.
All right, and I'm now really going to hand it off directly to you, Rivera. Rivera is going to start us off with an introduction to what is civilian-based defense. What are we talking about tonight?
Great, thank you. So for those of you who are part of World Beyond War already, civilian-based defense is one of the pillars in the global security system and alternative to war, which is the ever-evolving manual of World Beyond War for abolishing war altogether. So it's a core idea and concept for this group, and I think tonight you'll see a little bit why that is. It's certainly not the only idea this group explores, and we'll talk about that later on as well. I'm just gonna jump into a screen share here. And you all see my lovely civilian-based defense
Yes.
presentation? Excellent. So before we even jump into this, I'd like to just preface this by saying that I know myself and Philippe as well come to this field as civil resistance strategists. We work primarily with community groups and nonviolent campaigns. So a lot of civilian-based defense work has been done by policy experts, in partnership, especially with military defense strategists, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But our focus and our entry point into this is really as people who see our communities rising up to defend themselves over and over again with nonviolent action, which is the very premise of civilian-based defense. It's really very much an experimental field. Move that over. Doesn't want to let me. Okay. There we go. So civilian-based defense is very much an experimental field still. Nothing about it is set in stone, and it's certainly not entirely tested in the field. So while there are many different theories about civilian-based defense out there in the world, I think most of us working with this concept would agree that it's very much a Gandhian experiment in truth, let's say. It's very much something that we're all exploring and developing together. So there is no right or wrong way to eat a Reese's or to talk about civilian-based defense, but there are some core principles. You'll find it by a couple of different names in the world, including social defense, civil defense, and sometimes nonviolent defense, although that terminology tends to refer to a more principled stand of nonviolent action. But here are some core things. Civilian-based defense is nonviolent, unarmed defense used by civilians, not military personnel. That's a distinction. To protect citizens, society, organizations, or government bodies, land, water, resources, or communities from threats both foreign and domestic. You'll find that this definition is a little bit expanded from some of the standard ones that are out there in the field. And this is because I know for myself and probably for Philippe as well, what we're seeing over and over again in our field is that our communities are not just facing nation state threats. They are also facing corporate threats. This is a photo from Bentley, Australia, or actually from Northern Rivers, Australia, where they had 3 simultaneous blockades stopping what they deemed an invasion of the fracking industry into their communities that was putting their entire watershed at permanent risk of contamination. So in the work that we do, we see that civilian-based defense concepts are not just useful for talking about invading armies or stopping coups, they're also very useful for thinking about how do we defend against corporate threats, or also, we could talk about it in the context of some people are thinking about this in terms of terrorist groups or hate groups as well. There we go. So civilian-based defense draws upon the notion that governments or power holders rule by the consent of the governed or those they seek to hold power over or with. And that if you withdraw or refuse your consent and cooperation, those who seek to rule you simply cannot do so. To illustrate this point, I want to look at the Kampfputsch in Germany in 1923. This was a coup attempt when Wolfgang Kapp and his private army tried to take over from the Weimar government in Berlin. It was met with widespread resistance by the civilian population. In fact, the thousands of workers in Berlin went on strike. The banks refused to disperse money to the Kapp regime because they said he didn't have an authorized signature. I think that's very clever of them. He even had trouble finding a typist to type up his manifesto so he could meet a publishing deadline for the local newspaper. There was such widespread refusal to cooperate with his regime that in a matter of weeks, the takeover collapsed. This is just a great example of the many ways that we can refuse to cooperate with an injustice, the way that we can refuse to support a unjust regime coming to power, or an invading army, or in the case of, say, Bentley Australia that we just saw in that slide, one of the things that they did was the local hotels refused to rent rooms to this massive police force that was being brought in to break up the blockades. This was part of the turning point in their campaign when that piece of cooperation was refused, and instead the hotel owners decided to tell the blockaders when and where the police were going to come from and show up. This was a key part of their strategy. So in both those examples that I just talked about, those were emergent campaigns. Civilian-based defense is a little bit distinct in that it's marked by planning, preparation, and training. So rather than being an ad hoc struggle or an emergent struggle, civilian-based defense looks at the broad success rate of civil resistance. And indeed, civil resistance is twice as effective as violent means at several of the major goals of national defense, such as stopping foreign invasions and ending occupations. So we have a pretty good track record. And civilian-based defense says, if we're so good at doing this, why don't we plan to do this? We're kind of like an army right now that doesn't train, doesn't have anybody actually drilling, doesn't have any weapons prepared, has no strategy, has no theory of defense. This is what the field of nonviolent struggle is a little bit like. We're pretty ad hoc. But civilian-based defense encourages us to think differently about this, to say there is theory and strategy and a lot of knowledge about civil resistance, and we can apply it. We can actually build plans for all of the contingencies of threats that our communities might be facing. And ideally, we can be so prepared that this actually ends up being a deterrent to the negative things like invasions, coups, occupations, etc. Philippe's going to talk a little bit about that deterrent effect. Civilian-based defense thwarts threats by demonstrating, like I said, in advance or in action, that the populace is prepared to deny aggressors their objectives, mobilize widespread defiance, cause maximum local and international problems for any aggressors, subvert the reliability of troops and functionaries. If we're talking about corporations, then their personnel might go in that category, and ultimately defeat and deter aggressors. So this is my very uninteresting slide about a very fascinating campaign. People always ask, well, what about the Nazis? It's great that you want to abolish war, but what about the Nazis? It's great that you like nonviolent action, but what about those Nazis? Well, one of our key case studies for this kind of resistance comes from Denmark in the 1940s when they were invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany. They quickly ascertained that they were overpowered militarily, and so they chose not to fight an overt military struggle against the Nazis. Instead, they had widespread resistance of other means. 17-year-old Arne Sedger issued something called the 10 Commandments for Good Danes, which was supposed to go out locally to local leaders, but actually ended up becoming a widespread pamphlet that encouraged Danes to refuse to work for the Germans, give minimal effort in assisting the Germans, destroy the Germans' machinery and tools, boycott German goods, and provide for the protection of anyone oppressed by the Germans. This led to many, many different types of resistance. It emboldened the populace to actually take action against the Germans in a variety of ways, including rescuing 6,000 Jews. It was leaked that the Germans were going to round up the Jews and deport them, I believe, to France and to Poland, to the concentration camps. And in under 36 hours, thousands of Danes stepped up to hide Jewish people, including going so far as to check them into the hospitals under false names. And within a week to 10 days, actually managed to get the Jews out of the country to Sweden, saving most of their Jewish population. There are many different types of action that I don't have time to go into this evening, but this one boring photo is a shipyard. At the Danish shipyards, one of the Nazi goals of occupation was actually to use the Danish shipyards to build warships and to use the Danish workforce to do that. Well, the Danes refused to work unless they were directly supervised by the Nazis. And the moment the Nazis' backs were turned, they would start to unscrew the screws that they had just screwed into the ships. They were so good at slowing, thwarting, sabotaging, deconstructing their work in the shipyards that by the end of the war, not a single warship had been built for the Germans. In short, these are the kind of things that show that resistance can make it impossible for the occupiers to rule and achieve their goals. I also want to just say that when we're talking about the use of nonviolent action in civilian-based defense, we're going far beyond protests. In many of the situations where this type of strategy would use, protests are dangerous. And so we want to use other types of actions like refusals to work, refusals to give access to files, building alternative systems and governments, working to order but not going beyond what is being overseen or expected, undoing one's work, rescues of people, strikes and boycotts, refusals to register for lists, and so much more. When we're thinking about creating civilian defense strategies, civilian-based defense strategies, this is not guesswork. This is not just brainstorming your best and most brilliant and funniest ideas. This is very serious. You can have humor, but it's also very serious. You want to understand many bodies of knowledge, namely the intentions of your aggressors. What do they hope to achieve? What type of struggle are they willing to wage? Is this an invasion, a coup, a corporate assault? What are their goals and how can you deny them the achievement of those goals? You're going to need a robust understanding of civil resistance strategy, not just your favorite tactics, but actually an understanding of the theory and dynamics of the field. You also want to have a basic comprehension of military strategy or the strategies that are being employed by your aggressors. If you're up against a corporation, you need to think like the corporation thinks. This is the basis of strategic understanding in all conflict studies. So that brings me to the last body of knowledge, which I want to just thank Robert Burrows for bringing up to me, which is that we also want to integrate at this point in time the best practices for conflict transformation. These are ideas that have really emerged in the past several decades of research and understandings, and they have an impact on this work. I don't have time to go into it tonight, but to think outside the boxes of what we've already thought about in these fields and go beyond what we're taught in terms of basic war and military strategy into what we now know about conflict transformation. Even with the best laid plans, your civilian-based defense may not be enough to achieve your goals. We're looking at in the slides, Czechoslovakia, Prague Spring, where they resisted the Soviet troops. The Soviets expected to take over Czechoslovakia in 3 to 4 days. Instead, it took them 7 to 8 months because of the widespread resistance. They ultimately were able to achieve their goal, the Soviets, that is. And so this is a good reminder that even in civilian-based defense, there is a concept of overwhelming force. But we shouldn't hold civilian-based defense to any kind of standard that we're not holding military defense to. We all know that military defense doesn't always work. In civilian-based defense, we want to be realistic about what we can achieve and what are the risks of this field as well. I think one funny thing about Czechoslovakia that I like to bring up is that they also had 10 commandments of resistance, possibly inspired by Denmark. I don't know. It's a good thing to research. And their commandments were very simple and kind of humorous in retrospect. And they just said, when a Soviet soldier comes to you, you don't know, don't care, don't tell, don't have, don't know how to, don't give, can't do, don't sell, don't show, and do nothing. I like this list because it's very simple. It's fairly applicable to many different types of people engaging in many types of different resistance. And it's pretty memorable, gets the point across. One thing we say in civil resistance is that you can't lose if you never give up. That's a quote from Gene Sharp. And it's good to remember that if you fail at stopping a coup, for example, your civil resistance campaign evolves into a regime change campaign to oust that dictator or new regime. If, like in Czechoslovakia, you fail at an anti-invasion campaign, you can morph your resistance into an anti-occupation struggle, which is actually indeed what happened in the case of Czechoslovakia and led to the Velvet Revolution. So in the field of civilian-based defense, I think it's worthy to talk about Lithuania. Lithuania had a nonviolent campaign against the Soviet Union that succeeded in winning independence in 1991. Afterwards, as they were drafting up their constitution, they implemented civilian-based defense and civil resistance into their constitution. They were the first group, the first nationality to actually do that in the world that we know of. They still have it as part of their constitution. They've maintained it, even though other subsequent ministers of defense have pushed them in the direction of joining NATO style and European-based military alliances. They still have an active and robust civilian-based defense training program. In fact, recently, I believe maybe 4 years ago, when NATO was doing maneuvers on the Russian border and Russia was getting a little bit upset about this, Lithuania actually responded by reissuing their civilian-based training pamphlets and preparing the populace for any possible threat of invasion. They didn't name Russia directly, but it was in a direct response to the concerns that they were having around that. I think one thing that we can reflect on with Lithuania is that their civilian-based defense is not separate from their military defense. As participants in World Beyond War, our goal actually is to separate those two, not to integrate those two. You'll find this kind of integration under many different names, including hybrid warfare or total defense is the word that some people are using. Switzerland had a Cold War era policy that integrated by name civil resistance and nonviolent action into military and non-military anti-invasion frameworks. They used the hedgehog as a metaphor, which I thought was actually quite brilliant, which is the idea that they would be hard to swallow and prickly, and that if anyone tried to swallow them by invading them, they would regret it. And in fact, just as the hedgehog uses its spines as a deterrent effect, that predators see those spines and don't want to attack a hedgehog, so too was this robust form of defense intended to serve as a deterrent to anyone trying to invade them. So in World Beyond War's framework, we're trying to actually replace the military, not just be an addendum to their military strategy. And so I'd like to steer our attention in civilian-based defense to things that citizens are doing outside the framework of government to actually defend and protect the resources that we feel are valuable. This is a photo from 2016. It happened right after President Trump was elected. And scientists, rogue scientists in this case, were concerned that the Trump administration would take over NASA and destroy the climate data that we've spent decades compiling. So they organized citizens to actually hack into, they had some inside help with it, and ultimately back up an enormous database of climate science so that it could not be destroyed by the Trump administration. This is an example of what is possible with civilian-based defense. This was not necessarily pre-planned, but it is certainly a model that we can replicate with numerous other institutions that are under threat of destruction from various types of oppressors, you could say. Another example to look at happened with the Icarta seed bank in Syria in 2015. This is one of our oldest, it has one of the collections of oldest seed varieties in the world. It is a World Heritage seed bank. And militia groups in the area in 2015 started to cause threats to the seed bank, including burgling 100 vehicles, kidnapping 2 of the staff members, barring staff members from the facility. Overall warfare in the area was interrupting their ability to access power, which put refrigerated seed stocks at risk. So the citizens who were involved in the seed bank undertook a massive rescue operation of the seeds, ultimately smuggling 116,000 seed varieties out of Syria to Lebanon, Turkey, and Norway. They had something called the Norway Black Box, which had very important seed varieties in it. And these were recently reintroduced to parts of Syria, where this photo we're looking at is actually some of those seed stocks being replanted to help rebuild fields that had been destroyed or left untended during war. Again, this is an example of civilian-based defense of a priceless resource that was at threat from war. So civilian-based defense plans. When we are thinking about strategizing on this level, our planning should include who is going to resist, what parts of society, what groups of people, what are they going to do to resist, what are the types of actions they're going to take, where will these struggles occur? Will they be downtown? Will they be in government buildings? Will they be at seed banks, or will they be online, as in the case of NASA? Will they be blockades of the streets? Will they occupy radio towers like Lithuania did? These are the types of questions around where. When will they take place? Before, during, or after the concerning events? Particularly with anti-coup defense, we know that there are different types of resistance strategies for before an actual event, during an actual event, and after it happens. And why will these actions succeed? So what is our strategy? What are we ultimately trying to accomplish? What are we targeting in our opposition groups? What are we strengthening in ourselves? Plus, how are we going to do this? How are people going to know what to do? And this is a hallmark of civilian-based defense plans, that we're training for these things. We're not just making it up as we go along. We are preparing people. We are drilling them in the necessary skills and the necessary protocols for actually resisting. Just to give you a sense of scale of what we could be thinking on, this is Badshah Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's 80,000 person peace army. Badshah Khan was a contemporary of Gandhi's. He led the struggle in the Northwest frontier as part of the Indian self-rule movement. His Pashtuns faced some of the worst repression of the British Army. Several major massacres took place. They maintained steadfast nonviolent discipline, even though they were actually a populace that was rather notorious for their violence and for armed struggles that were going on in the area. They applied the discipline and the training that they used in those largely armed struggles to their nonviolent actions as well, drilling and training at a level that many other movements do not emphasize. And it made them very powerful and very effective. When we start to train in these ways in our communities, we can actually take on an impressive amount of existential threats. A good example of this comes from my friend Tom Hastings, who worked in northern Wisconsin for many years. They had a series of campaigns that cumulatively built civil resistance skills and civil resistance alliances in the populace, starting with Native treaty rights struggles, which asserted the sovereignty of the Native tribes and won back rights that had been denied them for over 100 years. These alliances that were built around this actually ended up becoming a core strength of stopping several destructive and polluting mines in the area for copper and other ores. They also blockaded sulfuric acid trains and stopped this incredible contaminant from moving through the region. And I want to draw your attention to the fourth point on this list, which is something that says ELF Naval Base, for all of us in World Beyond War who are trying to stop military bases. These alliances, this cumulative building of civil resistance skills, ended up helping them stop an extremely low frequency naval base on the shore of Lake Superior, to the point that this was going to be, this was a plan that had been put in place. There was actually a base already built. They were going to expand it to an operation that was like the size of Wisconsin, the entire state. And they ended up halting the base, ending the program, getting the base deconstructed, cleaned up, and now there are trees growing where there once was a base. Currently, these amazing people in northern Wisconsin are working on stopping a 30,000 head hog operation called a CAFO and stopping an oil pipeline, that's Enbridge Line 3. This should just give you a taste of what can happen when our communities start to train and drill in these skills and strategies. I'm not going to go into all of this, but there is a theory to civilian-based defense on what makes it succeed and what makes it effective. You can look this up with Gene Sharp's works, the work of Brian Martin and Jorgen Johansson is very important. Social defense is what they call it. And then lastly, I just want to conclude with bringing up an aspect of civilian-based defense that is underdeveloped and underspoken about. And you will find this in every researcher's work, and you will find us consistently ignoring these points. Civilian-based defense does not succeed best in a vacuum. It is strengthened and supported by citizens building self-sufficiency, decentralizing industries, increasing resiliency of our communities, building our versatility in our social movements and learning from the knowledge base that is in our social movements. And lastly, not thinking of this as a silver bullet solution, but rather pairing it with strategies of peace building, diplomacy, peace-based foreign policy, and the many other best practices for peace that exist. Really, we want to stop our conflicts long before they get to the point of civilian-based defense. It's really unwise and unstrategic to allow a conflict to snowball to the point where it is literally invading our homes. The more we can get in front of these struggles and deal with them way in advance, de-escalating conflicts and waging peace, the more safe our communities are ultimately going to be. I hope that this whirlwind tour of civilian-based defense has piqued your interest, has given you a couple frameworks to think about it in, and has really gotten you thinking about how you might be able to use it in your community. I'm going to hand this seminar over to Philippe and let him talk a bit about what they did in Quebec, which was truly visionary, is the single most exciting campaign I have ever heard about, and I follow hundreds of campaigns. Philippe and I both believe that civilian-based defense is best implemented as a strategy in our world, not from top-down addendums to military strategy, but rather from bottom-up community-based defense strategies that we are seeing people use over and over again in our world. So I thank you for your attention, and Philippe, I hand it over to you.
You're muted, Philippe.
Hello.
There you go.
So, thank you. So while I try to get my screen on, I just want to say how moved I am to see how many people there are sharing this on a weeknight. It gives me hope that so many of you would devote an evening to discuss this. Do you see my slides?
Yes.
Fantastic. So in case it isn't already clear, I think Rivera and I both share a vision that civilian-based defense really is what is prefigurative in a lot of what citizens do all over the world to defend their land, to defend their social societies, their social systems, their value, their culture. All of this is already, how shall I say, germinating in so many places around the world. And I was quite honored that she invited me to share a bit of a story here in Quebec, where we were successful so far for about 10 years in resisting the fracking industry. The St. Lawrence Valley, the largest river on the continent, from the Great Lakes to the east, was slated for 20,000 fracking wells at the turn of 2009, 2010. And I want to talk about an initiative that grew out of the popular resistance that came to resist that. And it started with a lot of on-the-ground action that led to some environmental assessment studies. This is one of them where we had an action where everybody stood up one by one to say, leave the shale gas in the ground for 1 generation. Groups sprouted across dozens and dozens of villages and cities and towns across the St. Lawrence Valley. And one of the first things we did was initiate a walk, 700 kilometers. How many miles is that? Maybe 400 miles or something, over a month. We visited communities, had daily educationals every night, and inviting people to think about, of course, giving out the information about what the industry does. We had a lot of examples from our neighbors down south, Pennsylvania and other parts. And so we launched this walk that crossed the whole St. Lawrence, the part of the St. Lawrence that was targeted. But our message was more than protest. Rivera made a very strong point that I want to emphasize, is this is not protest. This is civilian-based defense, in the sense that you are very much about creating the social power needed to prevent and to deter what you are fighting about, in this case, fracking. I'm going to quickly run through this, but it ended up with a big demonstration. 15,000 people joined us for what was at the time the largest environmental demonstration in Montreal. But I want to talk about the plan that we devised, which is rather unique, sadly, I think, but how we focused our energy on building a social force, an army of reservists who would be willing to basically resist through nonviolent action and nonviolent means the industry if it were to go ahead. It was emphasized by Rivera that the earlier a struggle starts, the more chances it has of winning. So we were upstream, rather, in the process, and that helped us. So how did this work? What we put in place here in Quebec was studied by consultants for the oil and gas industry. You could look it up on the web if you want. Control Risks is the firm. They said that this was one of the most sophisticated examples that they saw around the world of people being ready to resist the industry, including through non-cooperation and blockades, nonviolent direct action. And they emphasize the fact that blockades are quite expensive to the industry, and the relative cost to the civilian-based resistance is not as high as the cost we're able to inflict on the industry. What is the plan based on? 3 things. Vigil is monitoring, first thing. So this was a lot of focus was put on having on the ground monitoring of any testing, any drilling activity going on over the whole distance of the St. Lawrence. An alert system that would actually spread the information in case anything was ongoing in terms of exploration or drilling activities, and then a capacity for civilian-based resistance in the case of development. That early warning system was based on a simple website. All you had, this is not online anymore. It was shale911.org. All you saw once you got there was a red button. This is the idea that you would actually signal any suspicious activity, and this would go out to people who would validate the information, and a whole mailing list of people who would be told what is going on, where it is happening. And it's mentioned in the study that they did on us, that the industry did on us, that this was quite scary to them, that we would be able to contact thousands of people through an email list if ever something was happening on the ground. The second thing we did is use civil disobedience, nonviolent direct action trainings as a form of action itself. The trainings were used to create media interest that we knew was going to be monitored by the industry. And we were very deliberate, intentional in our use of nonviolent action training as a way to show the industry, look, we're getting ready. We're getting ready in this community and then this other community. We trained up to 500 people in civil nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience. And each one of them, of the people we trained, signed a pledge. Older members around are going to be remembering the Pledge of Resistance back in the day of trying to prevent the US invasion of Nicaragua. It's basically this idea that we adapted to basically ask people who were part of the trainings. There was never any pressure. It was every individual to themselves. Many people didn't sign it. Most people did. And they would commit to 5 years of making themselves available to the extent possible. I mean, we have no army, so we can't break legs where people wouldn't respect their pledge. But it was a code of honor, and people signed it saying, I want to do support, or I will risk arrest and perhaps go all the way to civil disobedience. We put a lot of emphasis on all the support roles, welcoming people in your home, cooking for them, doing transportation logistics. We invited all these people to take part in the trainings because one, it's a real need, and this is not a contest for who's going to be the most courageous, risk-taking person. A movement is very much about a continuum of activities from low to no risk to high risk, and inviting everyone to participate. They were handed a certificate, diploma. They had a little card with their photo, and that. So we were quite intentional in creating a basis for belonging to something that was pre-planned, organized, credible to the industry and to ourselves, that we were going to be ready in case the industry came. Third step was action plans, which involved all kinds of roles, from surveillance to accommodation to transportation. Some of you who might have been involved in various actions are going to do a lot of those roles. And we would take a lot of, we would work with local communities to think about where could be action sites. Sometimes we're just too limited in our thinking. So sometimes you could target storage sites, construction sites, subcontractors who are usually from the local community can be approached, decision makers from the corporations to municipal, regional, state governments. They need a lot of water, chemicals, investors, means of transportation, the drilling site itself, of course, which is the first or the high level site that most people think about. But then again, there are secondary targets among that. So I guess this goes to simply to show that, and that's why I think campaigns like this are prefigurative civilian-based defense projects. Is basically you learn how to do this stuff. If a citizenry doesn't know how to resist, I don't think, I'm myself, and I'm going to be very candid about this, I don't think the state is going to make itself illegal and outlaw war. I think what's most likely is that we'll need citizens to stop the war machine, as we did in other instances. And civilian-based movements are really where we could find the best school. Not to say that institutions couldn't teach a lot of the civilian-based resistance or social defense that we want to see. But I think the pioneering work of citizens all over the world is quite important. I'm going to end with a fourth aspect to the campaign, which was participatory videos made to distribute to the industry. This is only in French, so but basically the communities would do these videos and send them to the investors, send them to the government. And in those videos, you'd see people from the community saying, I don't want this in my community, and this is what I'm prepared to do. I'm gonna make sandwiches, I'm gonna sit in front of trucks, I'm gonna ride my bicycle in front of equipment, I'm gonna, welcome people on my land, and so on and so forth, showing that the whole community was united behind a single plan for nonviolent resistance to the fracking industry as an invader. So again, these are the element: preventative training, an early warning system, rapid deployment plans of action, those videos, and what you get is civil resistance as a nonviolent deterrent, which is basically, I think, the seed of mass citizen-based defense. I want to leave enough time for questions. I'm going to end with two basic areas for exploration, which you might want to explore with us or not. But one is, how do you build a capacity for civilian-based defense? Well, one question you might ask is, what are current or likely threats of invasion on my land, on my area of the world? If you think about it for a while, some people are facing pipelines, some people are facing development projects, some people are facing chemical use, expropriation, you name it. And whoop, I just switched one there. So the goal there is to devise and carry out a preemptive plan of civil resistance that hopefully can act as a deterrent. And if that fails, then you got to be ready to actually implement your resistance plans. This is not a poker game. This is not bluff. Second is, you might ask yourself, what is an existing force of occupation in my community? That might be a lot of different things. And therefore your task is to think and devise and carry out some proactive plan of social resistance that could liberate your area from that type of occupier. And it might be a war defense industry, it might be a base, a military base, and whatnot. So I'm going to end on this, and thank you so much. And we're going to be there for questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Philippe and Rivera. And now, Mark, I'll hand it over to you to help moderate the question and answer period. Mark, if you could let us know what questions are coming in on Facebook. And then for those of you that are here on Zoom, you can feel free to type in questions right into the chat box. So we'll first go to Facebook and then we'll come back to Zoom.
Okay, actually, I want to start with one right here, and this is from Lucy. And her question is, what about defense of the internet infrastructure? Look at Kashmir, and what about preparation for selective arrests? And this is to each of you. I think maybe we'll start in the same order. Rivera first.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the vital importance of remembering our communications lines now include the internet. This is a increasing area of oppression that's being used as a tool of oppression and repression to citizens all over the world in a wide variety of struggles. I would say that, you know, one of the aspects of civilian-based defense we talked about is about self-sufficiency and is about recognizing the many ways that our way of life or our communication systems or our finances are super reliant on institutions that are vulnerable to attack. So any good form of defense tries to lessen our reliance on those vulnerable points. As in the case of Kashmir, that is a really good example of how, you know, we have to have alternative systems. And there are case studies from civil resistance campaigns around the world of alternative systems of communication for when the internet is shut down. Palestine has several that I've heard about because their entire infrastructure system is always vulnerable. I don't have time to go into them now, but I think that is a very good point. As for the selective arrest, maybe Philippe, you can deal with that. I'm not sure I totally get that question, but I think you do.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, and that's always a concern, is what about once organizers are identified, if they get picked up and arrested preemptively, will that stop the movement? That's a very important question that can be addressed through one, planning, and what we call the onion structure, where you have multiple layers of leadership. Gandhi in India had that. Resistance movements around the world tend to adopt a structure that involves one, there's no one general. And that's an aspect where civilian-based defense prefigures also the democratic society that we want, in that we need our plans to be resilient enough to arrest of a few leaders because the plans are known, because people are trained, because people have been through the drill and know what it involves, because the master plan, as it were, and the 10 Commandments are good examples of that, is simple enough for people to replicate and apply outside of formal, you know, line of command type structures. So we need to have that, that is nimble enough, creative enough to be used by people, even if a whole layer of leadership is taken away and locked up. And in fact, that can backfire, as we know, and we have multiple examples of that happening. Yeah, very important question.
Great.
I see a lot of questions coming in on the Zoom chat. Thank you, everyone. And I also want to say, if you're dialing in with your telephone, you can ask a question. If you dial *9, and then that will raise your hand for us and we can call on you. *9 for those on the telephone. Thanks.
Okay, shall we keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. So actually, Rivera, you did briefly touch on Palestine, which was another question that came in. So I want to actually skip ahead to the next one. This is from Jerry, Reverend Jerry Maynard. How can you apply these strategies within contexts like neighborhoods where there is regular oppression from militarized police? Whichever one of you wants to take that one, go for it.
Yeah, I just want to say briefly about Israel-Palestine, that or Palestine-Israel conflict, that I think this is a wonderful question to explore. I'm not sure I have the answers ready for you this evening. It was something that I would love to sit down with a round table of Palestinian organizers and hear their thoughts on. That is one of our most entrenched and challenging conflicts right now. So I think it's a very valid question. In terms of militarized police in neighborhoods that are regularly experiencing their oppression, particularly in the US context, although this is not actually limited to the US context, I think there's a number of ways we can think about that. And I think also those communities and neighborhoods have developed strategies that are now being used and shared as civilian-based defense strategies. One that particularly pops to mind is recording the police on your cell phones. Has actually erupted as a form of resistance and documentation. I think also some of the dynamics of the Black Lives Matter rapid response and mobilization in the that in the wake of a tragic incident of a police shooting or brutality also fall into some of the framework now of civilian-based defense without actually using that name, or particularly the preparatory strategy, that we've now embedded these strategies within our collective response. I would say that there's a lot more that could be explored in there, and I think it is definitely an arena in which civilian-based defense could be applied and very, very helpful. It is a situation of occupation. It's also one that I would urge us to think also about, not just what do we do in our community types of civilian-based defense, but how do we pair with proactive kind of leading edge strategies of conflict transformation. Peace building in some situations of this has done a lot of work in de-escalating the school to prison pipeline and the unequal arrests of Black and brown youth. Gainesville, Florida is a case study in that.
And just to bring another element to a very complex answer to a very complex problem, but what has been used with a measure of success in many cases of occupying forces is to befriend the friend soldiers as much as possible. So having a program of outreach to actually go, and I'm not talking about trying to do that during a protest or while repression is unleashed, but really upstream to go and meet with police commanders, with police officers, meet them outside the cop shop if possible in their neighborhoods. They're also part of neighborhoods. And to really destroy the image that they've been building of, quote unquote, the enemy, and to really undermine their commitment to following orders, to encourage defections and non-cooperation. This is, of course, a long-term process, and I'm not suggesting that having tea with someone will result in instant conversion, but this one part of the tactical mix that might be considered.
Yeah, just to add on to that briefly, to also marginalize those police or army officers who are committed to brutality or racism or sexism or ethnic oppression through the power of their position. So by shifting those who can be shifted, you start to marginalize those who are really the worst actors. And we're not talking right now about the broader policy issues that go into the racist policing and brutality, which can also be discussed, but not tonight right now.
Great. Okay. This one, why don't we start this one with Philippe? And this is from Al. He's asking a question about leadership. How do leaders develop, and how does the CBD movement continue to recognize and support or change the leaders in this movement? Philippe, would you like to?
Briefly, I think, of course, leadership is central to any initiative like this. How do leaders develop? Well, they develop through training. They develop through the resources that we have, and most importantly, through on-the-ground practice and action. You don't become a strategist or even a good soldier, quote unquote, peace soldier, without being actually involved. So that kind of leadership, how to support them, how to maintain it. We might want to look at formal ways to nurture young leaders that are emergent. I think working with youth is central to any movement, and that would be my short answer.
Great. Anything to add, Rivera? Great. Okay. Oh, by the way, just one message came in, Philippe, that if you could go closer to the mic next time, that just came in through Facebook.
Sure.
Sounds fine to me, but okay. This is from Jamila. Thank you so much, Rivera and Philippe. Philippe, do you think the power capacity developed for one generation moratorium could be mobilized for other purposes and during future crises?
Very good question. I don't know if this is the Jamila Rakib, if that's you, a big hug and hi. Well, actually, the answer is they're already still mobilized and active and available for other current crises. We are gifted in Canada with the dirty tar sands oil. They've tried to push a big pipeline our way called Energy East. They've stopped that as well. We did that together. Using the same format and basically continuing the campaigning and that. And what we find is that these people who have had direct contact and experience with successful struggles, they tend to stay. Winning is a very good stimulant to engagement, and I think that's one of the greatest fruits that we reap from struggles that are waged strategically. Is people tend to stick with us longer and become their own leaders in their own right and push the limits for years and years. Thanks, Ruzmila.
Great. Okay. And this will have to be the last question, unfortunately. I would love to go on and ask a bunch of questions myself. I'll have to do that another time. This is another one from Lucy. What other parts of conflict transformation are being started? These seem like things mothers and fathers can teach their children and show how it might work in a political context. In other words, does that raise any thoughts for both of you in terms of how this can be applied?
Yeah. As a novelist who writes both for adults and young people, I think what resonates for me about this question is how do we weave into cultural themes, into our teaching, into our parenting, into the stories that we share of heroes in our world, these stories that we know from around the world that can inspire us to continue in this work and can actually become teaching stories for doing this work. Such as knowing about Badshah Khan's 80,000 person peace army. These are the kind of stories that instead of talking about Odysseus or talking about the latest Marvel comic hero, we can have them as household names in our conversations. What I see with the fictional work that I do is that it evokes curiosity about real life stories, which then in turn become these wonderful opportunities for teachers and parents to explore what is a hero and what are the kind of heroes that we need today, which then start to teach us basic principles of nonviolent struggle, basic principles of civil resistance, basic ideas about how to resist. And then that starts to inform how we go about thinking about making political change, where power is held, how struggles are organized, what are our routes for making change. For me, the cultural aspects of all of this are as important as understanding the history and the theory and the current practice. That if we want a culture beyond war, then we need to tell stories that are rooted in the real life case studies that we know and celebrating them.
Great. I think we're near the final thoughts section. So any last thoughts to add on to that, Philippe? And then I think we may need to wrap up.
Well, just to piggyback on what Rivera said, I think you know, our heroes are closer than we think. I have a 3-year-old at home, and I know sharing Rivera's stories when she understands English is going to be a priority. I think that deep cultural work is really important. I know who my heroes are. Many of you are on this call. Rivera is one of them. Jamila is one of them. Peter is one of them. I just wish we had more time to share those stories. of heroic resistance and long-lasting resistance that the next generation wants to hear, needs to hear. And with these words, I thank you all so much.
Yeah, if I can just tag on that and conclude. There are lots of questions that are coming in from people about this campaign or that campaign or this world situation, this conflict. And my encouragement to you would be to take that question seriously, to go and look for the answers, to dig into these ideas, Google it. Literally, that's how I got into this work. Was I was writing fiction and I didn't know how to get my characters out of the situation they were in, and I Googled how to bring down dictators nonviolently. So if I can do that, you can do that. And take your questions seriously. Find a group of friends and start to talk about it, start to dig into it, think about what Philippe did in Quebec, and start to do a similar thing with what you're thinking about, what you're working on. We are experts only in the sense that we spend a lot of time thinking about this, and that we have spent a lot of time thinking about this, and you too can do that very same thing. Our style of leadership is that we are all leaders, that we all have the capacity to create civilian-based defense plans, to take on these campaigns, to solve the world's greatest problems, and to actually be human and have fun doing it. So I really urge you to go forth from here with that spirit, to think that you are the ones that we've been waiting for. We are the ones that we've been waiting for, and that these are tools in your toolbox as well.
Thank you so much, Rivera and Philippe, and all of the panelists today and the participants. We will be sending a follow-up email so you can get a link to the recording, and we'll send some further resources and ways that you can connect with today's panelists to ask any additional questions. But thank you again for joining, and I encourage you guys to get involved with World Beyond War. I think many of the strategies and tactics that we've discussed tonight are very applicable to our campaigns to divest from the war machine and close military bases around the world. So if you go to our website, WorldBeyondWar.org, you can click sign our Declaration of Peace, and get involved with our campaigns. Thank you again. Have a good day.